Welcome to Governing Pandemics 101, a course offered by the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute. My name is Jan Bohanes. I'm an international trade lawyer based in Geneva, and I'm also a visiting lecturer here at the Graduate Institute. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the trade response of governments around the world to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we will discuss what those trade measures have shown us about the international trade governance system and the legal rules that underpin it. First, a few general reflections. Just imagine a country A, where producers do not produce enough domestic supplies needed to manage the pandemic. Things like personal protective equipment, disinfectants, pharmaceutical products, diagnostics, or vaccines. But consumers, companies, and the government of our country A can import these goods from country B, where production exceeds demand, where supply exceeds demand. But imports of crucial supplies will become particularly important during an emergency situation like a pandemic. Indeed, getting vital medical supplies to manage a pandemic with the help of imports is important for all countries, even the very large ones. By the way, in my example, I only mentioned countries A and B, so only two countries. But it's also important for our country A to trade with more countries than just country B. Imagine that production in country B is temporarily disabled, for instance due to a lockdown, or it is severely restricted. If country A trades also with countries C and D, it will be able to make up for the loss of imports from country B. And so what that means is that international trade is also an important risk management tool in a pandemic. So products often travel through multiple jurisdictions along these so-called global value chains or global supply chains. These trade flows too are very important, and it's very problematic when governments disrupt these global supply chains, because that has a lot of negative consequences for many countries and many consumers. So now let's look at how governments regulated trade during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. In a nutshell, the governmental response has been a mix between trade openness and trade facilitation and protectionist responses. By the way, an important element of reducing red tape at the border during the pandemic has been greater acceptance of electronic documentation, like import declarations, sanitary certificates, and similar documents. And that may actually be an important new development that will hopefully stay with us, the ability to process these documents in electronic format. That is, of course, a great trade facilitating measure. Governments also, importantly, relax technical requirements, technical and quality requirements for, in particular, medical products. So governments accepted that even if another country's quality and safety standards were not exactly the same as those that are in effect in their jurisdiction, that they could nevertheless be considered to be equivalent, that these products could be marketed and used in their jurisdictions. Now, just to be complete, on the import side, there were also a few import restrictions in the early days of the pandemic. In particular, when we were not yet fully sure about the transmission vectors of COVID-19. So there were some import restrictions, for instance, on trade in live animals. But by and large, import restrictions were just a very small part of the response on the import side. Typically on the import side, as we said, it was trade facilitating measures. Now on the export side, however, we saw a lot of restrictions. And that has been one of the main concerns about the trade response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many jurisdictions imposed export restrictions on exactly the kind of products and goods that the importing governments and importing countries were so interested in. Medical products, personal protective equipment, diagnostics, vaccines, disinfectants. Many producing governments decided that they would prefer to ensure first a sufficient domestic supply for their own population, and so they restricted exports. It wasn't just medical products and things immediately related to managing the pandemic. It was also sometimes food, raw materials, and yes, in some instances, even toilet paper. These exporting governments did so because, as I said, they were afraid of shortages. These export restrictions took many different forms. Sometimes outright export bans, sometimes export quotas, sometimes rules that first domestic demand had to be satisfied before any exports could occur, and many other types of measures, sometimes not very transparent. So it was difficult to know what exactly governments were doing. Now, the result of all these export restrictions was, of course, that many importing jurisdictions who had a serious need for these products could not really get enough of these supplies. It also meant that international prices for many of these products went up. And a lot of uncertainty was introduced into the global supply chains that I mentioned before. So these supply chains where these intermediate products are being traded. And of course, developing countries, and in particular least developed countries, were often particularly affected by all these developments. So broadly speaking, WTO law and trade law also at the regional or bilateral level is geared towards striking a balance between two fundamental competing principles. On the one hand, we want to ensure some free flow of trade, fair treatment, non-discrimination for imported goods and services, basic respect for intellectual property, and ensure that governments and consumers around the world have access to much needed products. On the other hand, we of course need to respect the government's right to regulate the trade in order to promote important societal interest, protection of public health, consumer protection, environmental protection, protection of public morals, national security. When governments regulate, they typically do it in furtherance of these important interests. And if that means restricting trade in some manner, then of course international trade rules are completely fine with it. But it's important to ensure that this regulation is calibrated in order not to restrict in a way that is unnecessarily restrictive. So that's the basic idea behind international trade regulation. Now remember what we said about the trade measures that governments around the world took in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They typically facilitated imports. Now that is of course not a problem from the perspective of international trade rules. Obviously freeing trade, making trade smoother is a positive thing. So there's no risk of non-compliance with international trade rules here, as long as it's done in a non-discriminatory manner, that you do not favor one supplying country over another, that you do not favor one trade partner over another. But what about export restrictions? Now, most legal experts would agree that in principle, export restrictions on essential goods, like medicines, personal protective equipment, during a pandemic can, of course, be legally permissible. Prioritizing your own population, avoiding shortages in your country, in your jurisdiction, ensuring that scarce resources are effectively secured for your own population, all that is in principle perfectly legitimate under international trade law, even if that happens at the expense of other countries. There's even a provision in the GATT, in the main agreement that governs trade in goods in the WTO legal system, that explicitly allows governments to impose export restrictions when there are critical shortages in food and other essential products. And governments generally enjoy a margin of discretion to assess for themselves whether such a critical shortage exists. Of course, there could be disagreements between two governments whether critical shortages exist. And in that case, the government that is affected by these export restrictions could bring a dispute at the WTO or in a regional trade agreement to resolve that dispute. It is difficult to draft precise rules that address every kind of scenario and avoid these disagreements. Now, these disputes, however, take a long time to resolve. So they're not a very practical way of addressing disagreements between governments in an emergency situation like a pandemic. It simply takes too long, and ultimately These export restrictions and other trade restrictive measures have a very strong political dimension. So law and litigation are not really helpful ways of resolving disagreements between governments. And so we really didn't see any formal litigation about these kinds of disagreements during the pandemic. Now, just because something is legal and just because there hasn't been litigation between WTO members about these trade responses to the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't mean that it is good policy. Most economists, policymakers, and commentators would agree that export restrictions are, of course, a big problem when that's the tool of governments to manage a pandemic. Restrictions like these cut off much-needed supplies from other countries who depend on them. They also lead to increases in international prices. And as we said before, it's particularly the poor countries that suffer most from them. Export restrictions also potentially harm the country that is imposing them because they reduce domestic prices, and what that means, there is no incentive for producers to produce more. And after all, shortages are best addressed by ramping up production. Finally, arbitrary recourse to export restrictions might also, in the long run, scare off investors, potential investors, who would otherwise come to your country and invest and produce, in part for export. Now, many governments at the WTO are very well aware of that. A good indication of that is that, for instance, at the height of the pandemic, a number of food exporting governments issued a declaration whereby they said that they were pledging not to introduce export restrictions on food, agri-food products. And therefore, what you see now that the pandemic has receded are discussions about initiatives about trade in medical products. A number of policymakers and academic commentators believe that it would be helpful to ensure for the future a more reliable flow of international trade in medical products, to strengthen the rules and principles underlying trade in these products in order to avoid disruptions like those that we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. WTO members are discussing these matters under the heading WTO Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic. You can find a lot of very interesting information on the WTO website, which is an extremely well organized and wonderful, transparent tool of information. Now, these various discussions and proposals aim basically to ensure that governments have less recourse to export restrictions. An important goal here would be to reassure many governments that it is not necessary, in order to safeguard sufficient domestic supply of medical products, pandemic-related products, to create or artificially foster domestic industries to produce for themselves. That a better response is to keep international markets open. That they shouldn't be afraid of being dependent on external suppliers. So many believe that an international system of interdependency and market openness is a better, more efficient tool than introducing trade restrictions and fostering domestic industries. Let me now mention two more trade-related aspects of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first is the much debated waiver for intellectual property rights on COVID-19 related products and vaccines above all. Some developing countries have proposed that waiver. By way of background, WTO rules include obligations on members to protect patents, the rights of patent holders. But in some situations, governments may grant so-called compulsory licenses or otherwise limit the rights of patent holders. Some believe that the uneven and unequitable distribution of COVID vaccines is related to intellectual property protection. Others disagree. It's a very controversial question, and we do not have the time to really examine that interesting and important debate. What is relevant is that governments at the WTO have been discussing this waiver that is authorizing governments to depart from WTO rules and limit the rights of patent holders for a limited period of time in order to enable greater production and distribution of COVID-19 related vaccines. Second, the economic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic has prompted governments to support the private sector, their industries, on an unprecedented scale. Governments have provided various forms of subsidies and market condition stabilizing support for many industries, saving millions of jobs and preventing the collapse of entire industries. Now, these subsidy programs could, in the medium and in the long run, now that the pandemic has receded, have important international competitive effects. Governments can complain about subsidies, harmful subsidies granted by other members through a litigation dispute settlement system, or they can impose duties, import duties that offset the effect of these subsidies. As is always the case with subsidies, the problem is, of course, that the wealthier countries can afford to provide more of these subsidies than more resource-challenged countries, developing countries, and especially the least developed countries. And in this aspect, the COVID trade response fits into a general trend in many jurisdictions where the state is becoming a stronger actor, a more active actor in economic life. This is similar to, for instance, state trading enterprises, state-owned enterprises, and digital governance. So in this sense, the COVID-19 trade response fits and feeds into a generalized trend. I hope you have found this general overview of the COVID-19 related trade response useful. As I said, the WTO website is a wonderful source of information about everything that I have said. So go and take a look if you're interested to find out more about some of these topics. Thank you very much for your attention.